Hello, this is Morel Benard with the continuation of the story, David Copperfield. Last words were that when Traddles pretends to see a ghost in the corner. And by the way, please subscribe to the channel StudyCoach UK and please share with others far and wide, please. Okay, let me continue with the story. I heard all kinds of things about the school and all belonging to it. I heard that Mr. Creakle had not preferred his claim to be a Tartar without reason, that he was the sternest and most severe of masters, that he laid about him right and left every day of his life, charging in among the boys like a trooper and slashing away unmercifully, that he knew nothing himself but the art of slashing, being more ignorant than the lowest boy in the school, that he had been a good many years ago a small hop dealer in the borough, and had taken to the school in business after being bankrupt in hops, and making away with Mrs. Creakle's money, with a good deal more of that sort, which I wondered how they knew. I heard that the man with a wooden leg, whose name was Tungy, was an obstinate barbarian who had formerly assisted in the hop business, but had come into the scholastic line with Mr. Creakle in consequence, as was supposed among the boys, of his having broken his leg in Mr. Creakle's service, and having done a deal of dishonest work for him, and knowing his secrets. I heard that with the single exception of Mr. Creakle, Tungy considered the whole establishment, masters and boys, as his natural enemies, and that the only delight of his life was to be sour and malicious. I heard that Mr. Creakle had a son who had not been Tungy's friend, and who, assisting in the school, had once held some remonstrance with his father on an occasion when its discipline was very cruelly exercised, and was supposed besides to have protested against his father's usage of his mother. I heard that Mr. Creakle had turned him out of doors in consequence, and that Mrs. and Miss Creakle had been in a sad way ever since. But the greatest wonder that I heard of Mr. Creakle was there being one boy in the school on whom he never ventured to lay a hand, and that boy being J. Steerforth. Steerforth himself confirmed this when it was stated, and said that he should like to begin to see him do it. On being asked by a mild boy, not me, how he would proceed if he did begin to see him do it, he dipped a match into his phosphorus box on purpose to shed the glare over his reply, and said he would commence by knocking him down with a blow on the forehead from the 7 and 6penny ink bottle that was always on the mantelpiece. We sat in the dark for some time, breathless. I heard that Mr. Sharp, Mr. Mell, were both supposed to be wretchedly paid, and that when there was hot and cold meat for dinner at Mr. Creakle's table, Mr. Sharp was always expected to say he preferred cold, which was again corroborated by J. Steerforth, the only parlour boarder. I heard that Mr. Sharp's wig didn't fit him, and that he needn't be so bounceable. Somebody else said bumptious about it, but his own red hair was very plainly to be seen behind. I heard that one boy, who was a coal merchant's son, came as a set-off against the coal bill, and was called on that amount, exchange or barter, a name selected from the arithmetic book as expressing this arrangement. I heard that the table beer was a robbery of parents and the pudding an imposition. I heard that Miss Creakle was regarded by the school in general as being in love with Steerforth. And I'm sure as I sat in the dark, thinking of his nice voice and his fine face and his easy manner and his curling hair, I thought it very likely. I heard that Mr. Bell or Mr. Mell was not a bad sort of fellow, but hadn't a sixpence to bless himself with, and that there was no doubt that old Mrs. Mell, his mother, was as poor as Job. I thought of my breakfast then, and what had sounded like my Charlie. But I was, I'm glad to remember, as mute as a mouse about it. The hearing of all this and a good deal more outlasted the banquet some time. The greater part of the guests had gone to bed as soon as the eating and drinking were over. And we who had remained whispering and listening, half undressed at last, betook ourselves to bed too. "Good night, young Copperfield," said Steerforth. "I'll take care of you. You're very kind." I gratefully returned. "I'm very much obliged to you." "You haven't got a sister, have you?" said Steerforth, yawning. "No," I answered. "Well, that's a pity," said Steerforth. "If you had had one, I should think she would have been a pretty, timid little, bright-eyed sort of girl. I should have liked to know her. Good night, young Copperfield." "Good night, sir," I replied. I thought of him very much after I went to bed, and raised myself, I recollect, to look at him where he lay in the moonlight with his handsome face turned up, and his head reclining easily on his arm. He was a person of great power in my eyes. That was, of course, the reason of my mind running on him. No veiled future dimly glanced upon him in the moonbeams. There was no shadowy picture of his footsteps in the garden that I dreamed of walking in all night. School began in earnest next day. A profound impression was made upon me. I remember by the roar of voices in the schoolroom suddenly becoming hushed as death, when Mr. Creakle entered after breakfast and stood in the doorway looking round upon us like a giant in a storybook surveying his captives. Tungay stood at Mr. Creakle's elbow. He had no occasion, I thought, to cry out silence so ferociously, for the boys were as all struck speechless and motionless. Mr. Creakle was seen to speak, and Tungay was heard to this effect. "Now, boys, this is the new half. Take care what you're about in this new half. Come fresh up to the lessons. I advise you, for I come fresh up to the punishment. I won't flinch. It will be of no use your rubbing yourself. You won't rub the marks out that I shall give you. Now, get to work, every boy." When this dreadful exordium was over, and Tungay had stumped out again, Mr. Creakle came to where I sat, and told me that if I were famous for biting, he was famous for biting too. He then showed me the cane, and asked me what I thought of that for a tooth. Was it a sharp tooth, eh? Was it a double tooth, eh? Had it a deep prong, eh? Did it bite, eh? Did it bite? At every question he gave me a fleshy cut with it that made me writhe. So I was very soon made free of Salem House, as Steerforth said, and was very soon in tears also. Not that I mean to say these were special marks of distinction which only I received. On the contrary, a large majority of the boys, especially the smaller ones, were visited with similar instances of notice as Mr. Creakle made the round of the schoolroom. Half the establishment was writhing and crying before the day's work began, and how much of it had writhed and cried before the day's work was over? I'm really afraid to recollect, lest I should seem to exaggerate. I should think there never can have been a man who enjoyed his profession more than Mr. Creakle did. He had a delight in cutting at the boys, which was like the satisfaction of a craving appetite. I'm confident that he couldn't resist a chubby boy, especially that there was a fascination in such a subject which made him restless in his mind, until he had scored and marked him for the day. I was chubby myself, and ought to know. I'm sure when I think of the fellow now, my blood rises against him with the disinterested indignation I should feel if I could have known all about him without having ever been in his power. But it rises hotly, because I know him to have been an incapable brute who had no more right to be possessed of the great trust he held than to be Lord High Admiral or Commander-in-Chief, in either of which capacities it is probable that he would have done infinitely less mischief. Miserable, little proprietors of a remorseless idol, how abject we were to him. What a launch in life I think it now, on looking back, to be so mean and servile to a man of such parts and pretensions. Here I sit at the desk again, watching his eye, humbly watching his eye, as he rules a ciphering book for another victim whose hands have just been flattened by that identical ruler, and who is trying to wipe the sting out with a pocket handkerchief. I have plenty to do. I don't watch his eye in idleness, but because I am morbidly attracted to it in a dread desire to know what he will do next, and whether it will be my turn to suffer or somebody else's. A lane of small boys beyond me, with the same interest in his eye, watched it too. I think he knows it, though he pretends he don't. He makes dreadful mouths as he rules the ciphering book, and now he throws his eye sideways down our lane, and we all droop over our books and tremble. A moment afterwards we are again eyeing him, an unhappy culprit found guilty of imperfect exercise approaches at his command. The culprit falters, excuses, and professes the determination to do better tomorrow. Mr. Creakle cuts a joke before he beats him, and we laugh at it. Miserable little dogs, we laugh, with our visages as white as ashes, and our hearts sinking into our boots. Here I sit at the desk again, on a drowsy summer afternoon. A buzz and hum go round me, as if the boys were so many blue bottles. A cloggy sensation of the lukewarm fat of meat is upon me. We dined an hour or two ago, and my head is as heavy as so much lead. I would give the world to go to sleep. I sit with my eye on Mr. Creakle, blinking at him like a young owl when sleep overpowers me for a minute. He still looms through my slumber, ruling those ciphering books until he softly comes behind me and wakes me to plain a perception of him with a red ridge across my back. Here I am, in the playground, with my eye still fascinated by him, though I can't see him. The window, at a little distance from which I know he is having his dinner, stands for him, and I eye that instead. If he shows his face near it, mine assumes an imploring and submissive expression. If he looks out through the glass, the boldest boy, Steerforth excepted, stops in the middle of a shout or yell and becomes contemplative. One day, Traddles, the most unfortunate boy in the world, breaks that window accidentally with a ball. I shudder at this moment with the tremendous sensation of seeing it done, and feeling that the ball was bounded on to Mr. Creakle's scarred head. Poor Traddles, in a tight sky blue suit that made his arms and legs like German sausages or roly-poly puddings. He was the merriest and most miserable of all the boys. He was always being caned. I think he was caned every day that half year except one holiday Monday, when he was only ruled on both hands and was always going to write to his uncle about it and never did. After laying his head on the desk for a little while, he would cheer up somehow, begin to laugh again, and draw skeletons all over his slate before his eyes were dry. I used at first to wonder what comfort Traddles found in drawing skeletons, and for some time looked upon him as a sort of hermit, who reminded himself by those symbols of mortality that caning couldn't last forever. But I believe he only did it because they were easy and didn't want any features. He was very honourable, Traddles was, and held it as a solemn duty in the boys to stand by one another. He suffered for this on several occasions, and particularly once, when Steerforth laughed in church, and the beadle thought it was Traddles, and took him out. I see him now, going away in custody, despised by the congregation. He never said who was the real offender, though he smarted for it next day, and was imprisoned so many hours that he came forth with a whole churchyard full of skeletons swarming all over his Latin dictionary. But he had his reward. Steerforth said there was nothing of the sneak in Traddles, and we all felt that to be the highest praise. For my part, I could have gone through a good deal, though I was much less brave than Traddles, and nothing like so old to have won such a recompense. To see Steerforth walk to church before us, arm in arm with Miss Creakle, was one of the great sights of my life. I didn't think Miss Creakle equal to little Emily in point of beauty, and I didn't love her. I didn't dare. But I thought her a young lady of extraordinary attractions, and in point of gentility not to be surpassed. When Steerforth, in white trousers, carried her parasol for her, I felt proud to know him, and believed that she could not choose but adore him with all her heart. Mr. Sharp and Mr. Mell were both notable personages in my eyes, but Steerforth was to them what the sun was to two stars. Steerforth continued his protection of me and proved a very useful friend, since nobody dared to annoy one whom he honoured with his countenance. He couldn't, or at all events he didn't, defend me from Mr. Creakle, who was very severe with me. But whenever I had been treated worse than usual, he always told me that I wanted a little of his pluck, and that he wouldn't have stood it himself, which I felt he intended for encouragement and considered to be very kind of him. There was one advantage, and only one that I know of, in Mr. Creakle's severity. He found my placard in his way when he came up or down behind the form on which I sat, and wanted to make a cut at me in passing. For this reason, it was soon taken off, and I saw it no more. An accidental circumstance cemented the intimacy between Steerforth and me, in a manner that inspired me with great pride and satisfaction, though it sometimes led to inconvenience. It happened on one occasion, when he was doing me the honour of talking to me in the playground, that I hazarded the observation that something or somebody, I forget what now, was like something or somebody in Peregrine Pickle. He said nothing at the time, but when I was going to bed at night, he asked me if I had got that book. I told him no, and explained how it was that I had read it, and all other books of which I had made mention. "And do you recollect them?" Steerforth said. "Oh, yes," I replied. I had a good memory, and I believe I recollected them very well. "Then I tell you what, young Copperfield," said Steerforth, "you shall tell 'em to me. I can't get to sleep very early at night, and I generally wake rather early in the morning. We'll go over 'em one after another. We'll make some regular Arabian Nights of it." I felt extremely flattered by this arrangement, and we commenced carrying it into execution that very evening. What ravages I committed on my favourite authors in the course of my interpretation of them, I'm not in a condition to say, and should be very unwilling to know. But I had a profound faith in them, and I had, to the best of my belief, a simple, earnest manner of narrating what I did narrate, and these qualities went a long way. The drawback was that I was often sleepy at night, or out of spirits and indisposed to resume the story. And then it was rather hard work, and it must be done, for to disappoint or to displease Steerforth was of course out of the question. In the morning, too, when I felt weary, and should have enjoyed another hour's repose very much, it was a tiresome thing to be roused like the Sultana of Scheherazade, and forced into a long story before getting up bell rang. But Steerforth was resolute, and as he explained to me in return my sums and exercises, and anything in my task that was too hard to me, I was no looser by the transaction. Let me do myself justice, however. I was moved by no interested or selfish motive, nor was I moved by fear of him. I admired and loved him, and his approval was return enough. It was so precious to me that I look back on these trifles now with an aching heart. Steerforth was considerate too, and showed his consideration in one particular instance in an unflinching manner that was a little tantalizing. I suspect to poor Traddles and the rest. Peggoty's promised letter. What a comfortable letter it was. Arrived before the half, was many weeks old, and with it a cake in a perfect nest of oranges, and 2 bottles of cowslip wine. This treasure, as in duty bound, I laid at the feet of Steerforth, and begged him to dispense. "Now, I'll tell you what, young Copperfield," said he. "The wine shall be kept to wet your whistle when you are storytelling." I blushed at the idea, and begged him in my modesty not to think of it. But he said he had observed I was sometime hoarse. A little rupee was his exact expression, and it should be every drop devoted to the purpose he had mentioned. Accordingly, it was locked up in his box and drawn off by myself in a fail, and administered to me through a piece of quill in the cork, when I was supposed to be in want of a restorative. Sometimes, to make it a more sovereign specific, he was so kind as to squeeze orange juice into it, or to stir it up with ginger, or dissolve a peppermint drop in it. And although I cannot assert that the flavour was improved by these experiments, or that it was exactly the compound one would have chosen for a stomachi, the last thing at night and the first thing in the morning, I drank it gratefully, and was very sensible of his attention. We seemed to me to have been months over Peregrine, and months more over the other stories. The institution never flagged for want of a story, I'm certain, and the wine tasted out almost as well as the matter. Poor Traddles. I never think of that boy, but with a strained disposition to laugh, and with tears in my eyes. What a sort of chorus in general, and affected to be convulsed with mirth at the comic parts, and to be overcome with fear when there was any passage of an alarming character in the narrative. This rather put me out very often. It was a great jest of his, I recollect, to pretend that he couldn't keep his teeth from chattering whenever mention was made of an alguazil in connection with the adventures of Gil Blas. And I remember that when Gil Blas met the captain of the robbers in Madrid, this unlucky joker counterfeited such an ague of terror that he was overheard by Mr. Creakle, who was prowling about the passage and handsomely flogged for disorderly conduct in the bedroom. Whatever I had within me that was romantic and dreamy was encouraged by so much storytelling in the dark, and in that respect the pursuit may not have been very profitable to me. But the being cherished as a kind of plaything in my room, and the consciousness that this accomplishment of mine was bruited about among the boys, and attracted a good deal of notice to me, though I was the youngest there, stimulated me to exertion. In a school carried on by sheer cruelty, whether it is presided over by a dunce or not, there is not likely to be much learnt. I believe our boys were generally as ignorant a set as any schoolboys in existence. They were too much troubled and knocked about to learn. They could no more do that to advantage than anyone can do anything to advantage in a life of constant misfortune, torment, and worry. But my little vanity and Steerforth's help urged me on somehow, and without saving me from much, if anything, in the way of punishment, made me, for the time I was there, an exception to the general body, insomuch that I did steadily pick up some crumbs of knowledge. Do join me. Join me for the next video, the next audio, the next episode of David Copperfield. Join me. Please join me. And please subscribe and please share. Join me for the next episode, next video of the story of David Copperfield. I'll see you soon. Bye.